series was delivered last year by the novelist, critic, and historian in whose honor the series was named. It was Dr. Stegner's particular suggestion that one of the fellows from his Stanford creative writing program might be the first of his successors in this series. We are thus indeed pleased that one of those fellows, Larry McMurtry, has accepted the task of being the first to follow his mentor here. Larry is going to talk to us tonight about novels and films, but first I want to chat a bit with you about Larry McMurtry, the man and the artist. Larry McMurtry was born in Wichita Falls, Texas, and spent his youth in and about Archer County on the north central border of that state. He came from several generations of cattle ranchers. In 1958, he graduated from North Texas State University, where early evidence of his literary inclination surfaced with his instigation of a so-called renegade magazine called the Coexistence Review. Reputedly, he also, while at North Texas State, wrote 52 short stories, which he later burned. He burned those prior to beginning work on the first draft of what was to become his first novel, Horsemen Passed By, which I think some of you got a copy of tonight. This novel was started just before he entered the master's program at Rice University that same year. Achievements then followed in quick succession. He became a Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford in 1960. His first novel was published in 1961, and Paramount Pictures began filming a version of that novel, HUD, which I know many of you know about, the following year. His second novel was published in 1963, and he received a Guggenheim Award for Creative Writing in 1964. The third and crowning achievement of this early group of novels, all about rural Texas, The Last Picture Show, was published in 1966. All three of these early novels have been reworked as films. Since 1970, McMurtry has published 5 more novels in which the focus shifts from rural to urban Texas, although the 2 most recent titles in that group of novels, Somebody's Darling, published in 1978, and Cadillac Jack, published in 1982, remove Texans from the mythos of their home state and take them to the west and to the east coast, respectively. One novel from this same urban group of novels, Terms of Endearment, is currently being filmed by Paramount and is due to be released at Christmas. McMurtry has also written another collection of essays, one of which I will just mention the first collection in a minute, and that collection, I understand, has been in galleys with a small press in Austin for 2 years. We don't know when that's coming out, I guess, Larry. A new novel number 9, I believe, will be about Las Vegas, called Desert Rose, will be coming out this year? September. Early in his career, Larry McMurtry is reported to have worn a sweatshirt on which appeared the label minor regional novelist. Clearly, the first adjective in this label was to be taken pejoratively. When one of my colleagues in the English department heard about this recently, he said, "Be sure to tell him that we, at least, don't consider him minor, we consider him a major regional novelist." Fortunately, criticism of McMurtry's work over the past few years has corroborated the appropriateness of the term major. The second adjective in this label, however, was more ambiguously pejorative and has been more difficult, I think, for McMurtry to cast off. Still, one must surely grant that a canon of 8, now 9, novels with centrally focuses upon the themes of initiation, love, marriage, loss, and death must indeed have escaped the confines of region and perhaps have found a place in the mainstream of American literature, if not world literature. I want to conclude these introductory remarks by reading a short passage from McMurtry's only published volume of nonfiction to date, a volume entitled In a Narrow Grave, Essays on Texas. This book is, at the time being, the best source of biographical information about Larry McMurtry. The passage I want to close with allows us, I believe, a glimpse of the creative force generating this man's work. I'm quoting. When my father was 12, my grandfather sent him alone with a small herd of steers to Graham, Texas, a town about 40 miles from our ranch. He was to sell the steers, buy new cattle, drive them home, and show a profit, all of which, from all reports, he did. At 12, I would have been hard put to drive a very docile herd of steers 40 yards. But at 12, I did discover Don Quixote. I was permanently altered by it, and just in time, too. Even if I could have driven a herd of steers to Graham, I should have had to cut 100 fences to get there, or else open 100 gates. In their youth, as I have said earlier in this chapter, this volume, my uncle sat on the barn and watched the last trail herds moving north. I sat on the self-same barn and saw only a few oil field pickups and a couple of dairy trucks go by. That life died, and I'm lucky to have found so satisfying a replacement as Don Quixote offered. And yet, that first life has not quite died in me, not quite. I missed it only by the width of a generation, and as I was growing up, heard the whistle of its departure. Not long after I entered the pastures of the empty page, I realized that the place where all my stories start is the heart faced suddenly with the loss of its country, its customary and legendary range. Ladies and gentlemen, Larry McMurtry.
Was taught by Malcolm Cowley and Frank O'Connor, both of whom were very good. And I finally encountered Wally Stegner several years later on the lecture circuit. And in fact, the only times I've seen him about the last 20 years have been on the lecture circuit. I did have a t-shirt that said minor regional novelist, which I thought was precisely descriptive, actually. But unfortunately, in one of my numerous moves, I left it at the laundry. And before I realized what had happened, the laundry had thrown it away. So that was about 15 years ago. I haven't had it since. What I really like to do when I come to speak is to try to satisfy your curiosity to the extent that I can about the two arts that I've been involved with, i.e. novel writing and movie making. And it's your curiosity that interests me most. I'm going to talk rather generally for a while about my experiences in these two arts, and then I'm going to let you ask me questions, because I suspect that you have particular things that you've always wanted to ask a writer, and if you didn't get a chance to ask me at the dinner party, perhaps you can ask me tonight. It occurred to me, listening to myself be introduced, that I've been writing fiction for 25 years. I started writing, I graduated from a little school about the size of this one. It's actually grown much larger now, but in 1958 it was about the size of this one, called North Texas State. And in my junior year in college, I drifted into a creative writing class. Actually, I went to college mainly, the thing that I remember about college is reading. I grew up in a comparatively bookless area in West Texas. It probably explains why I now have a bookshop with 25 or 30,000 books in it, and also a personal library that's quite extensive down in Texas. I've never been able to get enough books, and I've never been able to get enough reading. And the only thing that one of the things that's always slightly irked me about being a writer is that there's a really intricate relationship between writing and reading. And I think reading is absolutely essential to writing anything of value. And my gripe, if I have one, about the way creative writing is handled in the universities now, is that people are sort of pushed into writing before they have either any experience as human beings and have really nothing to write about except their childhood and adolescence, but even more importantly, pushed into it before they have any reading, before they have any real, serious, deep frame of reference to the very traditions that they're trying to write in. And I began to notice, began to feel, I drifted into a creative writing class merely out of curiosity. I had taken most of the other English classes available to me, and I got into that one just to see what it might be like, what I might do. I found right away that there was something fascinating about it, about writing. And what was fascinating about it was the process of invention. I hadn't studied language in any serious way. I knew a little French and a little English, and that was about it. I didn't come at it with a very solid philological roots. Right away, I discovered that working with one's own imagination was really interesting, really fascinating. Not recording, not reporting things that you've seen or people are describing people that you know, but trying to make up people that you had never met and never would meet. Trying to make things up. I felt a little uneasy. It is true that I wrote 50 some odd short stories when I was in 1 year in North Texas State, and it is true that I burned them all, fortunately for everyone. But now that I look back on that experience, I think that there was an assumption underlying the normal, and everyone in the creative writing classes in those days was taught to write the short story. I think on the assumption that in some way a short form is easier for a young person than a long form. Well, that, of course, exactly the opposite is true. The long form is always easier than the short form. The hardest form of all, the lyric poem, is an excruciatingly difficult form, and the short story is as close as you get in prose to the lyric poem. It's extremely concentrated. It requires a kind of discipline, a kind of concentration, absorption, and skill that is just vastly beyond the reach of most students. So I floundered around with this, realizing that something was wrong. Actually, I never learned to write the short story. I simply gave up. And the day I graduated from North Texas State, 25 years ago, 25 years ago this month, I started writing a novel, a book called Horsemen Pass By, which grew out of 2 failed short stories. One about the funeral of an old cattleman, the other about the destruction of a cowherd due to hoof and mouth disease. And I sort of intuited a connection between those 2 stories, neither of which were any good as stories. And I began to write this novel simply because I sort of arbitrarily decided that I would do it. I didn't really feel like a writer at that stage of my life in any very committed or profound way, but I happened on to a practice or a habit of craft, which I think eventually resulted in making me a writer. That is, I was about to enter graduate school and become a PhD and teach English, and I only had so much time every day, and I decided I could only do so many. I would write this novel. It's just I would write 5 pages a day, which I did, and I marched right straight through Horsemen Pass By at about 3 times the length that it was eventually published at, And then I went on and I wrote what eventually became Leaving Cheyenne and yet another novel before any of these books were published. But the secret that saved me was writing 5 pages a day. Every single day, virtually, of my life, in 25 years that have passed since then, I've written 5 pages of something. Not something that necessarily gets in print into the final draft of a novel, an essay, a screenplay, or whatever, but the habit of practicing the craft, such as it is, every single day, regularly, for either, it doesn't have to be a fixed number of pages, it can be a fixed number of hours that you spend at your work, or whatever, has stayed with me all these years and has been the thing more than anything else that got me deeper and deeper and deeper into writing. Now, in the 25 years that I've been working in fiction, I've seen a lot of changes in American publishing, for example. When I wrote Horseman Passed By, I had practically no trouble getting it published, although it was a very slight first novel. It had Texas as a setting. That alone would probably have gotten it published in those days. 25 years ago, publishers were still more or less committed to publishing fiction. They more or less, they had some money, and they more or less still had the habit of doling out modest advances to young writers and supporting them for a book or 2 or 3 in the hope that eventually they would write a book that would pay off. At this time, I don't believe there was any bias against fiction in the publishing world. Well, that has changed, much to the sadness of the generations of young writers that have come along in about the last 15 years. Publishers really don't like fiction anymore. They really don't seek it. They really don't, they publish it with a sort of weariness, much as they have published poetry in America for a long, long, long time as a sort of Mandarin thing to have on their lists to prove that they're still gentlemen and publishers. But they're not eager for it. And the obvious reason that they're not eager for it is that nonfiction has been outselling it in ever-increasing ratios over about the last 15 years, and now outsells it to such an extent that it's not funny to contemplate. We have seen, I'm constantly asked if I think that there's a threat to fiction or to literature from movies, music, video games, all the other things that might be conceived to be threats to literature. I don't think so at all. The threat to fiction has been journalism. What has happened in my time that I've observed is the rise and dominance of a kind of journalism that is partly based in fiction, that is in the techniques and the styles of fiction practiced by the generation of journalists that are usually called the new journalists. And they're very good journalists, but they are having their cake and eating it too, to some extent. They are managing to use techniques that novelists and fiction writers developed and retaining the appeal of fact. And what's happened is those books are selling, the novels are not. Documentary journalism has sort of eliminated the necessity for a kind of novel that used to be a real staple of the reading public, the novel of information, you might call it. You want to know what life is like on a Texas ranch? Do you read a novel to find out? Now today, you can see a documentary about what life is like on a Texas ranch. And that whole level of fiction has pretty well had the floor cut out from under it. The shoe really pinches now on developing writers because the reluctance of publishers to spend any money on fiction, on first novels. I believe when Horseman Passed By was published, there was something like 130 first novels published each year by American trade publishers. That number shrank drastically in the quarter century that I've been writing to something like over half, maybe 50 to 60 first novels published each year now. This is a great problem for young writers. It means that, it means that to get a novel published today, the first novel, requires the kind of obsessive persistence that it takes to get a movie made today. For example, it is so difficult, the odds are so long, that only those people who persist to the level of fanaticism generally succeed in getting their books published. I know of first novels that have been that are better than my first novel, that have been in manuscript for 12 and 13 years. Eventually, usually, people persist, they get published. But this has thrown a big warp in the careers of the authors, for the most part. You need to write your first book, publish it, get it behind you, forget it, and go on and write other books. And even if you go on and write other books and it's not published, it's sort of just sitting there like a lump, that you can't quite just get behind you. You're still trying to do something with it. It can really throw a person's career off. There's another misfortune that sometimes happens with first books, which is that an author will write his or her best book first. This is a calamity, so far as I'm concerned, particularly if it happens when the writer is relatively young. Somehow, in cases like, say, Walter Percy or Joseph Heller or several others that I could name, an author will just strike it with sort of full force on the first lick, and it's very, very hard to go on from that. They go on from it, but it's mainly in a repetitious, sort of unsatisfactory way, unsatisfactory to them as well as to their readers. Well, what changes occur in one's thinking about writing if one does it every day for 25 years? It's a peculiar activity, to a large extent. You spend your day sitting in a little corner with a strange machine of some sort. I still use the old-fashioned strange machine, just a portable typewriter, but more exotic machines have already come into use. Pouring your best intellectual and perhaps emotional resources into creatures of fantasy. How does that affect you? How does it affect your life? And how does it change as an activity as the years pass? I've been thinking about that a lot in the last 10 years, particularly, because I noticed a striking change in my attitudes toward my own work over those years. When I started writing, I really enjoyed it. I really liked language, and I really liked making things up. And I still like making things up. I still think that working with the imagination and letting it play, more or less, is a fascinating activity. But a change did happen. For 10 or 15 years, I would enjoy I would like what I was writing as I wrote it. As the pages emerged from the typewriter and the sentences and the paragraphs came up and the characters appeared and went about their lives, I liked it. I liked what I saw. I thought it was interesting. I often turned against it very rapidly once the book was published. I write each book 3 times. I participate in the emotions of the story 3 times. And when I've done that, I'm through with it. I've lived with it as long as I want to, or as long as I'm capable of living with it. And then it goes out into the world, and it becomes my readers, or movie directors, or anyone who wants to have it. I'm done with it. And I often, if I glance back at one of my books, would become sort of disappointed and irritated at how much less good it seemed 2 or 3 years after it was published, and it seemed as if it was coming out of the machine. But that's something that most writers have to deal with. What I noticed about 10 years ago was that I had stopped liking my writing as I did it. That is, as the sentences and the paragraphs appeared, I hated them. They seemed extremely boring to me. They seemed depressingly familiar, very much like, after you've written about 10 books, you begin to lose track of what you may have said, and even who you may have created, and they begin to sound like sentences and paragraphs that might have been in other books. And in reflecting on this problem, and it's a real problem, because if you don't like what you're doing as you do it, it puts a different coloration on your days than it does if you like it while you're doing it and then hate it 5 years later. I decided that, in the first place, it's extremely unnatural to have to read one author every day for a quarter of a century. You know, it really is. There were great scholars who managed to get through their lives working every day with Dante or Shakespeare or Homer or a few others. But even that, even they probably occasionally allow themselves the relief of a detective story or something. It's just unusual to do this peculiar thing in which involves reading yourself constantly every day for 25 years. So I devised also, I do think that there is a, you know, that the thing that is often overlooked about art is that it's a real chancy thing. You know, there's sort of the feeling, perhaps in America, perhaps everywhere, that you grow up and you get educated and you learn a trade, and as you practice it, you improve and you get better and better at it as you go through life in a sort of ascending, you know, on an ascending graph. But art really doesn't work that way. You know, it isn't progressive. There's absolutely no reason why you have to get better. It's just as likely that you'll get worse. And it's particularly likely that you'll get worse after a stretch of time. I sort of, when I got interested in this problem, I was beginning to hate what I wrote, I began to look at the careers of the major novelists from the 18th century to now. And I discovered that it's fairly exceptional for for a novelist to do really major work over a stretch of much more than 10 or 12 years. You know, it's interesting to speculate why certain talents in certain arts locate them, how they develop at different ages. Painters, for example, are often very good when they're old. They're often better when they're old than ever. Musicians, on the other hand, and chess players, and mathematicians, that's a very young gift. They're usually done by the time they're in their mid-20s. The novel seems to favor early middle life, sort of 30s and 40s. It's very rare for a novelist to be good when he's in his 60s or 70s. I mean, you just look and read the books of the great novelists that they wrote that were written when they're in their 60s or 70s, and how many of them are really first-rate books? Not very many. That's a sobering consideration. But what I finally devised as a strategy to defeat my own dislike of my writing is to always have several projects more or less moving along at once. That is, I'm not necessarily writing on 3 novels simultaneously, but I'll write on one until I can't stand it any longer, then I'll lay it aside and write on another until I can't stand it any longer, and then I'll pick up the first one and read it again, and perhaps it won't be quite as bad as I thought it was. Perhaps I will see signs of hope, signs of promise, and then I'll go back and work on it for a while, and I'll carry on that way. And that's mainly a way of keeping in shape. It's sort of equivalent to doing exercises, you know, and it's what you do if you want to preserve the opportunity of breaking through at some point in your later years into something new, you know, a new depth or something like that. You have to keep in shape, and if you do it, you get a little bonus once in a while. I recently got a real bonus after about 10 years of writing that seemed to me to be dull and sort of pointless. I've been struggling along for 4 or 5 years now, intermittently, on a long trail driving novel, a book set in the 19th century West, trying to understand why so much of the romance of the cowboy came out of those few brief years when cattle were driven from south to north. And it did. It didn't come out of ranch life. It came out of trail driving. So I've been plodding along with this novel, but it is a god-awfully long novel. I mean, they started at the Mexican border, and I've written 1,500 pages, and I only got them about to Fort Worth, Texas. And I'm trying to get them to Montana, so I don't know if this book will even be publishable when I finally finish it. But so I was chugging along on it and getting bored with it, and I got sent by a movie studio to Las Vegas because a movie studio had decided they wanted a movie about the real life of a showgirl. I'm sure you're all familiar, most of you have been to Las Vegas, and know what a showgirl is. I mean, technically, what a showgirl is, a tall, statuesque woman who does not dance, does not sing, and does not act, but basically simply strolls around the stage attired in gorgeous feather costumes. Well, like that passage that was quoted from my earlier work, I do have a certain fascination. I am fascinated by dying ways of life. And the cowboy was a dying way of life, and I grew up as it was dying, with it dying around me, and I got 2 or 3 books and parts of others out of this phenomenon. Well, the showgirl is a dying way of life too. It's about dead. The shows in Las Vegas are now dance-oriented, and they want young, agile girls who can dance, not tall, big-bosomed women who just stand around on the stage. And I was only in Las Vegas 2 or 3 days on this assignment. I think the movie studio wanted a comedy, and I didn't find anything that I thought was very comic about the situation, but I did meet a showgirl who had retired happily, married and retired happily, and was living out in the desert raising peacocks. And somehow I thought that this woman who had spent her life, working life, attired in feathers, should be out in the desert raising peacocks. It struck me as really interesting. And I went home to write the movie treatment that I had been sent to write, and by the time I had written 2 sentences, it had turned into a novel. And in less than a month I had written it. Because I think it's one of the only bonus I've got in the last 10 years. I think it's partly because I was so bored with the Western. It's also because I wrote the book in first person. It is infinitely easier to write in first person than it is in third person. Your process of selection is narrowed immensely. And if you happen to hit the right tone of voice, when you start a narrative in first person, it just goes like that. And so I did happen to hit the right tone of voice, I think, for my showgirl. And I wrote the book in 3 or 4 weeks and sent it off practically unchanged. And that's a little piece of luck. Now to switch abruptly from talking about fiction, which I'll be happy to come back and talk about some more when you ask me questions, let me make a couple of distinctions between writing fiction and between working in film. The simplest distinction, there are 2 distinctions that are primary. One is, of course, that writing fiction is a private act. It's an act that you do by yourself, in which you are working entirely with the resources of your own intelligence and imagination and emotions. Filmmaking is an essentially collaborative act in which many people with all different kinds of skills and abilities and competencies are working in a sort of maelstrom of activity to try to produce a film. It's very, very different, and it's essentially collaborative. It's not something that's even the most altruistic films of the most altruistic directors still involve a vast amount of collaboration, far more than what is involved in the writing of any novel, poem, or short story. Another distinction, and one that's just as determinative of the way the 2 arts work, is that writing fiction is cheap. Fiction writing is a cheap art. It's very cheap. You know, I can take a couple of reams of typing paper and a couple of typewriter ribbons and enough rent money and grocery money to get me through a couple of months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, however long the project is. And I can write a novel. And that's not very much money. But the going rate for a film made by an American studio and released today is something like $12 million. Well, talking about a vast difference there. When $12 million has to be raised, spent, accounted for, and made to reproduce itself, hopefully several times over, you're dealing with a radically different set of pressures and a radically different kind of activity than what happens when a novelist sits down by him or herself to write a book. It's no less interesting an activity, really, and in some ways it's more interesting. There's much more to talk about making films than there is about writing books, because you have all, because it's an art that is inextricably linked to an industry, The artists almost never have the money. They almost always have to go to the places where money is, which is banks. But that is only one tiny part of what they have to do. They have to go and persuade the bankers to give them the money, and the people that have the money somehow almost always tend to be smart, and they don't tend to be easily persuaded by, artistic aspiration or things like that. They want concrete. They want something concrete before they turn loose of this money. I know that some of you have seen the movie HUD, which was made from my first novel a long time ago, about in '61. Well, why did that movie get made? It cost $4.5 million of 1961 money, and it was made from my first book. They certainly didn't borrow the money on the basis of this little slight novel, even though it was about Texas and it did have cowboys in it. The screenwriters bought the book. Were relatively run-of-the-mill Hollywood screenwriters. The story, fine, the story was sort of okay, but I think last year in Hollywood, 18,000 screenplays were registered with the Writers Guild. I discourage people from writing screenplays just as I discourage them from writing short stories, because the competition for the few markets that there are so extreme. The New Yorker magazine, which is now virtually the only regular paying market for periodical short stories in the English-speaking world, really, gets about 1,200 submissions a week. And that's a lot of short stories. And 18,000 or more screenplays are registered with the Writers Guild every year in Hollywood. That's a lot of competition. They have warehouses and warehouses and warehouses and vaults full of scripts that have been bought and produced, from the time that the movies began. There's not any shortage of stories and properties. How'd they get the money? They got it because the screenwriters perceived in this book a role that, if it were expanded intelligently, might be a role which would attract a major star. And that's how it worked. They built up the role of HUD, which was a fairly minor role in the novel, and they sent it to Paul Newman, and Paul Newman liked it. And because Paul Newman was big box office, the money was immediately forthcoming. That's basically what the star system is. It's a system of financing. Every time a movie is started, first of all, they have to figure out what they can do to attract someone that they can borrow the money on. Now, my own career contains a kind of anomaly called the Last Picture Show, which would seem to contradict this. The Last Picture Show is a historical freak in terms of getting made. The book was written and published in '65. The movie didn't get made until '71. The book was scripted almost immediately after it was published, but it was considered a teenage movie. And in the late '60s, there was no way to finance a teenage movie. There were no teenage stars. But by some miracle, right around 1970, a movie called Easy Rider was made for about $1 million, and it made about $50 million. And this made everyone in Hollywood wild with joy, particularly the people that made Easy Rider, who also were the people that made The Last Picture Show, because they had managed to make a low-budget movie without stars that made a very large return on its money. You have to remember that, it takes about 3 times the cost for a movie to break into profit. HUD didn't really make that much money. It cost $4.5 million. It made about 17. It wouldn't have broken even until about 14 or 15, something like that. So it didn't make a whole lot of money. But The Last Picture Show, HUD was an example of a movie made in the old days of Hollywood. It was very bloated, 120 people on the crew. 65 or so of them had separate cars with separate drivers. Every morning you see a long line of limousines parked on the prairies, and Limousines would drive up 50 feet and the star would get out and go work for 20 seconds and get back in the limousine, etc. It's very, very expensive. The story that I tell in my essays about the buzzard is an example of Hollywood film. Buzzards is an example of Hollywood filmmaking in the old days when they were not very conscious of spending, when they were very liberal with spending money. Horseman Passed By is a novel about a ranching family that's herd is destroyed by hoof and mouth disease. Well, in the novel and in the movie, the old rancher finds a dead heifer lying out on the prairie. He doesn't know what killed this heifer. He wants the vet to look at the carcass, and he sends some cowboys out to keep the buzzards from tearing it up until the vet can come. In the movie, this is exactly the way it is in the book, he is worried about this death, and he calls his wild stepson, Hud, back from his early morning amours to come and look at this carcass with him. Hud is not too interested. They get in a pickup and they drive out to where the carcass is, and there the heifer and there are the cowboys, and on some trees around the carcass there are some buzzards. Well, for some reason, the director had it in his head that he wanted to work this way. The pickup would drive up, Paul Newman would jump out. He would be irritated anyway, and he'd see these buzzards and he'd be mad at them, so he jumps out, grabs a rifle, and shoots one of the buzzards, whereupon the rest of them flap up into the sky and fly away. For some reason, he was particularly keen about getting them flying off the limb. Now, the only content of the scene is at the moment when Paul Newman shoots at the buzzards, the old man, exemplar of the moral values of the Old West, is outraged by this act and turns to him and says, "I wish you wouldn't do that, Hud. They keep the country clean." That line is in the movie. That's the dramatic content of the scene, which is actually the point of the whole picture, the contrast between the values of the old man and the lack of values of the young man. It's made over and over, point is made over and over and over again, both in the book and in the movie. It really doesn't take a scene. Time is always money in movie making. They had such trouble with those buzzards, they couldn't get any buzzards in the panhandle. They had to trap the buzzards down on the Mexican border, fly them up to the panhandle, wire them to the trees, so they wouldn't fly back to the Mexican border. And, they were going to be released electronically when Paul Newman shot the gun. But once wired to the trees, the buzzards were impatient and began to flop around and dislodge themselves so that they hung upside down. And this went on for about a day. Well, 120 people with 65 rent cars, the production was costing about $150,000 a day. That's a lot of money to waste on a scene with buzzards in which there's only one line that you want to get, which has been made 50 different times in the course of the movie anyway. They never did get it. They finally got the buzzards to stand up on the limbs, sit up on the limbs, and then when they released them, they wouldn't fly. They never did get it. It was totally wasted. And I'll tell you, today it wouldn't get into the second draft of the script. They would say, "What? You think we're going to spend all this money to get these buzzards and train them to fly when you release them? Forget it. Cut it, put the line somewhere else, let him shoot at something else. You could do it another way, Make him fill a beer can out the window of the pickup or something like that. You could do it much, much more cheaply." And that's the kind of script decision that would now be made. A script, you think of it as an aesthetic entity to some degree, but it really isn't until the very last stage of the making of any film. First and foremost, it's a budgetary instrument. When I write a movie script, and I've written about 22 or 23 now, very few of which have yet found their way to the screen, although probably, since this process normally takes 5 or 6 to 10 years, some of them probably will, in some form or another, at some point in the next decade, find their way onto the screen. When I do a script, I usually do it either with a director or a producer, and his strategy is to get the script, which lays out the story as forcefully as possible, and develops characters that major actors might want to play, because without the major actors, you aren't going to get the money. The movie of mine that's just being made now in Nebraska, it's just finishing this week, called Terminsman German, is a story about middle-aged courtship. It's about a vivacious widow living in Houston who has some problems with her daughter, doesn't get along with her daughter too well, but is enjoying her life, has 6 suitors, and sort of plays them off against one another in a kind of anti-Mamie fashion. Well, it's an appealing book in a lot of ways, and the widow is an appealing woman in a lot of ways, and almost always, but she's 50 years old. It's unmakeable because the woman is 50 years old. There's no 50-year-old actress in the world that can get a movie made. In fact, the only actress in the world in America that can get a movie made just by saying, I want to do this movie, is Goldie Hawn. She's the only one that is box office proven enough to be able to do it. Now, there are many other actresses that are pluses in the making of a movie, and that if you get, you get them, then you have a leg up. But you don't have the movie. And in this case, in the case of Terms of Endearment, the poor little director who had been struggling to get this made, Jennifer Jones bought the book because Jennifer Jones wanted it as a comeback vehicle. The only problem was nobody wanted Jennifer Jones to come back. Evidently, not even her husband, Norton Simon, is one of the richest men in America, could finance quite a number of movies if he chose, and he didn't choose to finance this one. So she lost control of it to a rich and powerful TV producer who, in the end, finally got it made, but it took him 5 years of dogged persistence to put it together, piece by piece. What he had going against him is that it's really kind of a depressing story, Terms of Endearment. Nothing quite works out. The widow is really wonderful, but nothing quite works out, and her daughter that she doesn't get along with dies of cancer at the end of the book, and the best of her suitors turns out to be an 80-year-old general who she really doesn't get along with very much either, but he has more gumption than the rest of them, so she eventually makes an accommodation with him. Well, that's not stuff that's apt to make an audience walk out of the movie theater feeling good. And Hollywood really wants people to walk out of the movie theater feeling good. So this TV producer, who's a great power in television, he really had to struggle. He had to struggle for about 4 or 5 years, and he only got it done finally because Deborah Winger became a fairly hot star in the last year as a result of Officer and Gentleman, and she decided to play the girl, and that helped. And then what clinched it was they changed the general to an astronaut to make him, to make him of an age that might attract a male star. Always what I thought. Now, this is really a book about women, but I always knew that sooner or later they would have to expand some male part in order to get a star that was big enough to get it made. And Jack Nicholson decided he wanted to be the astronaut, so it got made presto changeo. But even with Jack Nicholson, Shirley MacLaine for The Widow, and Deborah Winger, the studio, I think, still was not really happy about having this movie made. And they were very niggardly. They let it go through. And they put up a certain amount of money. But such a niggardly amount of money, considering that half of it has to go to pay the 3 stars alone, and the rest of it has to go to pay everybody else and produce the whole movie, which has 3 expensive locations in New York City, Nebraska, and Houston. That's expensive just to move a movie crew around like that. They're very niggardly. I mean, I haven't suffered from this myself because I haven't been around the production, but I know that when you don't have, always in movie making, you run out of money. You have so much money, no matter how, as I said, the script is originally a budgetary instrument. It goes to determine how much the film is going to cost, how many houses have to be rented, how many stars do you have to pay, how many cars do you have to rent, how many, you have to create natural disasters like tornadoes and floods. They can budget it pretty well, and they will budget it in an elaborate number of ways. When the Last Picture Show was made, for example, it was a time when long movies were doing badly, and they wanted a 2-hour movie and not a second more. And so we worked on a script. I did the script of that one with the director, and we worked on a script until we got a script that should have been just under 2 hours. It was 118 pages, and a page equals about a minute of screen time, in theory. But everything about a script is theory up to the point where the studio actually gives them the money and they start producing it. Then it ceases to be theory and it becomes a very tangled sort of mass of unyielding fact. And fine, we had a nice script, we had cheap actors, none of whom were stars at the time. We had a young director who was just right for them. It's just a miracle, this director getting this material at the right time in his career. It's one of those things that very rarely happen. Even so, many things can go wrong, and he took, when the real director, and the directors can change 5 or 6 times as the project goes through several studios and producers and et cetera, and the stars change and the script changes and everything. But this time they got the $1 million that it was agreed would be enough to make this little film. Small crew, not like HUD, just 22 people. No rent cars, an old school bus to drive them back and forth from the sleazy motel where they were kept. And they thought they had the script pretty well, perfect 2-hour movie. Except that when, you know, the director is a creative person, the actors are creative, the technicians, or everyone on the movie set has something to say about the script, the costume designers, et cetera, et cetera. When they all actually get the go signal and they go to Texas and they start putting it together, the actors, you know, says, hey, wait a minute, I don't like this scene. Why don't we spread this scene, sort of cut it in two, put part of it here and part of it over here, or something like that. Anyway, when everyone began to make their creative contributions, which was their right and duty, really, it's what they were hired for, it began to stretch out. The scenes began to play longer than they were programmed to play on the script. And within a week's time, what had been a 2-hour movie had become a 3-hour movie, to the disgust and horror of the producers who wanted only a 2-hour movie. And it's at this point that screenwriting ceases to be a kind of exercise in theory and a kind of blueprint for a film that might someday happen, or a form of dramatic notation, and becomes a mad scramble. Because the studio is, I mean, the people that are putting up the money were adamant. You have got so many dollars, they're going to run out on December 22nd, 1970, which is exactly when filming stopped. And you cannot shoot one more day past December 22nd, 1970. So everything that you're going to get in this movie has to somehow be got in the period between 1st of November or 6th of November, whatever it was, and December 22nd. And shooting was already going on. People were being paid. Scenes were rolling every day. And yet a third of the script had to be cut at that point without losing the essential qualities that you wanted in the film. This was, of course, something that the director had to do in consultation with everybody, but still he had to make the decisions as to what would stay in and what would be cut. For example, there was a wonderful basketball game in the novel. It's the only part of that novel that I still really like is the basketball game. It would have been a wonderful tour de force for a director to direct. It was a slapstick basketball game played in a little tiny high school gym. He wanted to do it, but it would have taken 3 days of shooting time, which he could have better used on other, more dramatically germane, relevant portions of the story. And if the movie ran over length, it would be the first thing that was cut because it had nothing to do with the plot at all, really. It was just a funny basketball game. So he decided reluctantly not to shoot the basketball game, but to spend his time and what little money was left shooting a little bunch of sequences involving the preacher's son, which was closer to the whole theme of sexual hypocrisy which ran through the movie. These kind of decisions are constant in making a movie. You always know that there's going to be the day when they're not going to pay the bills, after which they're not going to pay the bills and everyone will have to go home. You have to see what you can do in the length of time you've got with the money you've got. It's unfortunate, though, when you know before you even start shooting that you don't have enough money, because it creates, as I think probably was the case with Terms of Endearment, without being really too close to it, it creates a even greater sense of anxiety. Also, and usually in cases like this, when it's a project that the studios are not real thrilled to have, they will make somebody put up some kind of bond. That is, if the director is known for going over budget, they'll make him put up his salary as a completion bond. If it goes over budget by 1 day, he starts losing his salary. If it goes over a week or 2 weeks, his salary all drains away. I know they did this in the case of Terms of Endearment, although this man has never made a movie before. that he had in order to get the money that they gave him, the base budget, he had to put up quite a number of $100,000 of his own money as a completion bond to just take care of any overruns that might occur if he shot 2 days longer or 3 days longer or something like that. It's always a race against time, and it's a kind of contest between warring elements. And it's the director's job is to try to deal with all these facets that he has to deal with. First, the money. Getting the money, convincing someone that this story and these stars are worth X number of $1 million. Convincing the studio to let him have certain kinds of control. Getting a writer all this time working on a script which may undergo 5 or 6 different drafts and maybe 5 or 6 different writers for that matter. Then pitching the script to the stars so that you get the stars you want, and if you don't get the stars you want, then you're lost. Or maybe you can go to a second level of stars and still put something together, but you won't get that kind. You won't get the same kind of money. It's an activity which is so complex, involving so many different elements, only a few of which are artistic. That is, there are elements that are beyond the artistic that are involved in the production of every movie. That it's a miracle if some director or producer manages to control it, more or less control it to the point where a movie can be made. Why I feel lucky as a novelist is because I never feel threatened in my capacity to work. As long as I can afford that ream of paper and that typewriter ribbon and that rent money and grocery money, I can always work. I can always write books if nobody publishes them. Somebody will probably publish them simply. None of my books have made any money. None of them have even paid back their advances. But they haven't lost any money either, because through various subsidiary means, like movie sales, my publishers have always sort of gotten their money back, and a little publicity to boot. So they will keep on publishing these books. And I don't feel that I have to stop working. But every director is constantly threatened, and most actors and actresses are constantly threatened with the loss of the chance to work, because the director has to consistently produce movies that pay off, and at the same time try to satisfy his or her own artistic consciousness and do something that's aesthetically valid and still commercially successful. And that's very difficult. Well, I think I've rambled on in a general way about enough. What I'd really like to do now is take some questions from you and find out what you're curious about. Yeah.
You say that Goldie Hawn is capable of just pulling a script out of the air and making a movie then. What about, say, an actress like Ellen Burstyn, who was in the last show? She works in a lot of films. How does it go?
She just gets hired. Ellen Burstyn is very lightweight at the box office. She is actually of more weight, I think, theatrically than she is with movies. She's a very good actress, but she is not a major star, and she's not in the top 10 or even 15 in terms of bankability. She can't get a picture made. She's not a disadvantage, and if it's a role that's right for Ellen Burstyn, she's an advantage to a picture. But there's got to be a lot more weight, box office weight there from her. Any other questions? Yes.
Are there literary novels that are actually born to be movies as well?
Well, my feeling has always been that there are certain kinds of books that make good movies, that adapt well, and they are very seldom, they're almost never great books, and they're very seldom first-rate books. They're usually a certain kind of book. If you look at the fiction that has tended to make the best kind of movies, look at my own two. The two novels of mine which I consider least effective novelistically are the two that made the best movies. Why? Several reasons. When a director goes to film a masterpiece, a literary masterpiece, he's inhibited from the beginning. He feels that he's got to film and he's got to be immensely respectful of this literary masterpiece. He also feels he's got to somehow find a cinematic style that will be the equivalent of the prose style of the book. Well, that's just impossible. You know, a book is a reading experience and a movie is a watching experience. They aren't the same kind of experiences at all. If a director goes into an adaptation inhibited, he's going to make a stiff, strained, forced movie, which is what usually happens when people film classics. But you take a little book like The Last Picture Show, which is a little minor regional novel, and it is got good characterizations and a pretty good storyline, no style to speak of, simple, and not not anything anybody's ever heard of. The director feels quite free to come in, bring his own style to it, and do a real adaptation. I think that's good. I think that a curious thing with Terms of Endearment, which I like best of my own books, I don't think it's very cinematic. I understand why a filmmaker would be attracted to it, the characters, because of the characters. But it's a deceptive attractiveness which, underneath which lies many traps and many chances of failures. And I noticed from what little I've heard about this film that the director has been a bit inhibited by me in some way, although the one time I spoke with him I was very friendly and I didn't do anything that I thought would scare him or put him off. And I do genuinely wish him well. Still, he's a little inhibited. I didn't want to go on the move, didn't want to go by the step, because I thought that would be, he's got enough trouble. He's got to deal with Jack Nicholson and Shirley MacLaine and Deborah Wiggins. And not having enough money, why should he have to deal with the author of the stupid book, which, he's the one that suffered for 5 years to get the thing made. I think that he did an interesting thing. The daughter in this story, one of my favorite of my own characters, a woman named Emma, who eventually dies, is in 3 of my books. This is something that it's interesting to do as a novelist, is to carry characters over from one novel to another, or to take a minor character in one book and give them a book of their own. Well, Emma is about my favorite character, and I really, I wrote about her in three different books over a period of about 10 years before she died of cancer in Kearney, Nebraska. But when I first started writing about her, she had been married about 2 years. She was about 22 or 23. And it was in All My Friends Are Going to Be Strangers. She didn't have children yet, but she was already a married woman. The one time the director came to talk to me about the difficulties of this project, first thing he asked me was Emma a virgin when she got married? And I was totally nonplussed because I'd never given the matter any thought. She was married when I met her. I didn't know what to say. I just said, I don't know. I doubt it, but I don't have any real way of answering that question. And he really came back and he sort of harped on it, and he sort of was obsessed with it, actually. And whereas I took Emma Harden from the age of 23 to her death at the age of 37, he has taken her from her birth to her death at the age of 37 in the film. And I think that's interesting. I think it's done to escape me and the weight of that book in some ways. I think he's put all those years, those 23 years that I didn't consider into the film because it gives him a kind of freedom. He can do, he was stimulated by that book to do something. Otherwise, he wouldn't have spent 5 years of blood and sweat to do it. And I think that's real good. I think that's what a director should do. He should find a way, if he wants to go around the book, take the character and find a part of the character's life that the novelist hasn't done. It might be very interesting, and I might be very curious to see what Emma was like as a little girl. But I think that's the motive for doing that, is to get out from under it, to not feel just tied into this book. And I think that's fine. I think when people are disappointed in a movie made from a book that they liked, it's because they sort of naively expect the movie to reduplicate the reading experience. But it isn't a reading experience. It isn't going to reduplicate it. And the more free the filmmaker is to really dig in and change, the better the movies have to be, I think. Yes?
Which art form do you admire the more, the novelist or the filmmaker?
Oh, well, I admire the novelist, only because I think I understand what the novelist deals with better than I understand what the filmmaker deals with. But I do think it's a nearly miraculous thing. I don't think it's a miraculous thing to write a good novel, a first-rate novel. I think that maybe there's a little bit of an element of luck in it, but there's also a lot of, it can be done if you have the skills, the will, and the discipline to do it. But you can't say that of a movie, because you can have all those things, and this has been shown in the careers of director after director after director. You can be just as talented, just as skillful, just as disciplined, just as desirous of creating a fine work of art, and just things get out of hand. You know, there are too many things to control. You know, stars begin to hate one another, and their scenes don't play well, or they fall in love with one another, and problems result, or one will divorce the other, and you know, human factors like that play an awful big part in how movies come out. It happened on the last picture show. The director was a married man when he started the film. His wife was the costume designer, set designer, production designer. She did practically everything besides direct the film. And a month later, he fell in love with a starlet, and his marriage broke up. And before he fell in love with the starlet, one of the young actors, Jeff Bridges, had fallen in love with her. Well, he didn't like it that she immediately switched from him to the director. So there were 2 or 3 scenes which did not make it into the film, in which depended upon the 3 actors, Timothy Bottoms, Jeff Bridges, and Sybil Shepherd, having sort of warmth for one another, as, you know, kids, and they didn't. Jeff Bridges was mad at Sybil, and Tim Bottoms hated everybody in the whole movie, and you put them in a car together, instead of getting youthful camaraderie, you got hostility. And those scenes just had to be taken out of the film, and some of them are pretty interesting scenes as they were conceived, but they didn't work. So I have immense respect for a director that can, or a producer, or anyone that can somehow control this amazingly complicated process. It's much more complicated than one novelist, I think, controlling his own imagination and making it yield something. Yes?
When you begin a novel, like, for instance, Las Vegas Rose, that you said a couple of sentences, you knew you had a novel there. Did that arise from a plot idea or a characterization, or how do you commence?
All of my books, every single one of them has commenced with the ending. Although it's a little bit different in the case of The Desert Rose, but not much, because I knew the ending precisely before I wrote those first 3 or 4 sentences. I already had been thinking about it. Usually I won't do it that quick. Usually a scene will begin to form itself in my head, a scene in which people are talking or something, and it gets very particular. I can see it very clearly, and I realize that it's the end of a story, the end of a process of some sort. Maybe it's the end of a town, like the closing of the picture show, or I don't know exactly. I know it's the end of something. It's the end of a story. That doesn't mean I know the story. It only means I know the end of the story. And then I go back and I start writing toward it, sort of arbitrarily, and characters pop in that aren't in the final scene that I don't anticipate, and they get mixed up in various ways. But I always know the end, and I always go to it. And I think I really was in Las Vegas a very short time, and I was talking to this I met 2 showgirls, and one of them was a young showgirl. She was about 18, but she had been a showgirl since she was 13, and she had been a dancer. She had been started by her mother as a dancer in Acapulco, actually, when she was 13 years old, and her mother was a showgirl. And that's all she said. She wasn't anything wrong between her and her mother or anything. She was a born-again showgirl. Quite a few of the showgirls are born again, and there's a wonderful minister there on the Strip in Las Vegas who conducts Bible classes in rotation backstage at the various shows on a rotating basis each week. But it's what she said about her mother getting her started that gave me the kind of inkling of the clue to this novel, that and the Peacocks. What if, I like mother-daughter, I'm interested in mother-daughter relations. What if an aging showgirl were to be replaced in her own show by her own daughter, a young dancer? which is what happens in the novel, more or less, and the mother leaves town. And the ending that I had, I knew that the showgirl was going to leave town at the end of the book. She does. So, but they all start with endings, basically.
What was it like writing from the point of view of a woman?
Oh, I always liked to write from the point of view of a woman. I've done it. I started doing it almost as soon as I began to write. I think I did it in. I certainly did it in Leaving Cheyenne, my second book, in which there was a whole section of the book. I did it in my Hollywood novel, Somebody's Darling. It's nothing. It's easier for me than writing from the point of view of a man. Much easier, particularly a man my own age. That's really a problem I have as a novelist. I'm just not interested in men my own age, particularly. I'm interested in old men, I'm interested in kids, but other than that, my men are kind of blank. Yes.
Have you done all your own script writing for your novels? If so, is it an easy transition from writing a novel?
No, the only one that, well, I have adapted 2 of them. The Last Picture Show, which has been produced, and a book called All My Friends Are Going to Be Strangers, which hopefully will never be produced. No, it's not an easy transition. It's not because I'm difficult to work with or possessive of the material. It's the reverse. It's because I'm through with the material before I would get to it as a screenwriter. Like I say, I write those books 3 times. That's about as much as you can, many times as I can live through the story. So maybe, you know, the book gets published and 6 or 7 years later, that, you know, someone buys it for the screen and asks me to adapt it. Well, to go back to something that I've been away from and finish it 6 or 7 years is very difficult. And I know that I won't make a good adapter. If I could be hired instantly while I'm writing the last draft and produce the screenplay sort of as on the same momentum that I did the novel, maybe it would work. Never has happened that way. Maybe, but I didn't think I did a very good job on The Last Picture Show. I worked only because the director and his wife were fresh to the material because they were responding to it so vividly. I sort of picked up their glow, and I did an okay job. But a lot of it was the result of their response and me sort of recording it. I didn't like the book very much, and I was 6 or 7 years past it. So it's difficult. And I won't do it if I can help it.
How did you feel about your fantasy when you viewed it on screen after all this process? Could you identify with it at all?
Yeah, I could identify with The Last Picture Show. It's a catch, you know, it's something that varies from picture to picture. When some of y'all saw HUD, I understand. I saw it again after a gap of about 12 or 14 years. And when it came out, I thought it was a pretty good film. And I guess it's a pretty good film, but it's not really a good film. It has one distinguished performance by Patricia Neal, very distinguished. And the rest of it, I think, is pretty mediocre. Because it's a bad script, really. Like I say in an essay I wrote about it, that was my first novel. I had a hard time with my editor. I had written a novel about the destruction of this family as a result of the loss of their herd, and the herd were killed in the first chapter. And my editor didn't like that, and he wanted some suspense. And after 2 or 3 years of wrangling and revising it until I was sick and tired of the whole book, in fact I hate that book because I worked on it so long after I should have been through with it, I just said, who cares? And I changed it around and put the cattle killed at the end, close to the end. What that does is make the death of the old man very unconvincing. This is this old man of the Old West who has, you know, been through Indian wars and droughts and tornadoes, and so his cattle get killed, he falls off his horse and dies. And I think it's very unconvincing. It's very unconvincing in the novel, and it's equally unconvincing in the film because the scriptwriters were slavishly faithful to my script. They could have done better than that, but they didn't think beyond the novel. So I don't think that's a very good script. The Last Picture Show succeeds, I think, to a very large extent, as I said, because it's a case of the right director getting the right material at the right time in his career with the right amount of money. It was a shoestring production, very small crew, lots of communication between the 20 people that were involved in it, a lot of excitement. Everyone who worked on it believed in the project. And you'd be surprised what an enormous difference that makes on the movie, you know, because it's real tiring. It goes on, you know, bone fatigue sets in after about the second or third week. And if you have this vast crew of 120 people, 85 of whom are not doing anything for most of the day but sitting around drinking coffee and telling dirty jokes and getting more and more remote from anything to do with the story that they're involved with, it degenerates into a horrible, just a sort of a horrible business. If you have a small, tight crew and everyone likes what they're doing and they're really helping one another and sort of at least talking to one another about the problems as they arise, it can be good. And I thought that that was a very successful piece of work.
What are you writing now? And I'm also curious to know these 5 pages that you are daily dedicated to writing. Are you a morning writer or an evening writer?
Oh, I'm back chugging away on my immense trail driving novel at the moment. And I do write early morning as I get older. Early morning becomes more and more and more the best time. But I've gone beyond the 5 pages. I very seldom have a day that I don't do 10 pages, and sometimes, a lot of times I do 15, but not fiction. I'll do 5 pages of fiction still is all I do, and I do that first. And then later in the day, I'll probably have 2 more sessions in which I'll do screen work of various kinds, depending on what project I've got going. Yeah.
Do you feel that screenwriting and cinematic work affected your writing process or style of your later novels?
I can't tell that it does, because I can do the 2 things simultaneously, working in the morning on fiction and working in the afternoon on script writing. I can't tell that there's any real leakage back and forth. You see, I say this constantly, and it offends people in Hollywood terribly when you say it, but script writing isn't really like writing at all. It is important that certain things that you do in writing, such as creation of character and good dialogue, and most of all, accurate motivation, get into a script. You put those things in. But a script is like an immense jigsaw puzzle, which is put together over a long process, which can be years and years and years, by various teams of people that are constantly changing. And my job is to try to keep the motivation, as far as I see it, is to try to keep the motivation accurate. So many movies are so badly motivated, they're just unbelievably badly motivated. I just try to get the motivation, try to get the characters alive. I'm not a good constructionist. I'm not very much interested in construction. I'm not very much interested in the intricate process of developing transitions in and out of scenes and bracketing them and juxtaposing them. I don't usually get to that stage. I'm usually dropped as a writer before that happens. I get the characters alive, and I try to get the motivations, and then I'm usually dropped, and they go on to someone else who can do the things I can't do, and that's fine. That's the way it should be. But I don't think there's much leakage between the 2. Was there a question over here? Yeah.
Do the 5 or 10 pages a day include 2 rewrites?
No, I go right straight through, and then I go right straight through again, and right straight through again. And the revision stages.
In other words, do you do those rewrites on other days?
No, I do a complete draft at 5 pages a day.
Yeah.
Then the rewrites are done at 10 pages a day. They're much easier. It's not such a visceral. Rewriting is for correcting mistakes, or eliminating bad guesses and redundancies and stuff, and polishing the style. That can be done at 10 pages a day, as far as I'm concerned, or even more if I'm really in a hurry. But the visceral business of creating people in the first place and getting the first draft done, I don't like to do that more than 5 pages a day. It's a matter of pacing. And if you read the biographies and interviews with writers, you'll find this said over and over again. Sure, you can have your hot days when you write 15 or 20 pages. But for the novelist, this is dangerous, because pretty soon the well dries up, and you have days when you don't write any pages. Better just to tick along. They're endless. I wrote one book that was nearly 3,000 pages in manuscript. That's a lot of 5 pages. And if I tried to do that in 20-page gasp, 20-page goblet, I'd never get through it. I'd wear out, and I'd get tired of it, and I'd drop it, and it wouldn't get finished. So I don't do that. Yeah.
What do you think have been some of the more creative film adaptations in the last 10 years, say?
Oh, my Lord, I don't know what to say to that, because, you mean adaptations from novels?
Novel to film.
A horrible problem that arises when you write screenplays, is also a problem that I've had just writing fiction, is that doing something like writing fiction or writing scripts sort of kills you as a participator in those activities. I don't read much fiction. I do occasionally have fiction binges, but by and large, I don't want to write fiction half the day and read it the other half the day. I want to read history, or I want to read biography or letters or something. By the same token, since I've been really writing a lot of screenplays, I've seen almost no movies. You know, it's become a professional task to see a movie. I only do it if I'm asked to. Innocent pleasure of just going into a theater and seeing a movie, I just lost it, you know, and I've been compensated for it, so it's okay, but I don't know when I've seen, I saw the Flannery O'Connor movie. I didn't think that was a very good adaptation. Good Man is Hard to Find. What have I seen? Saw the Anne Beatty, didn't think that was very good either. I don't know whether I've seen any good adaptations in the last 10 years. The best adaptation I've ever seen is Jules and Jim. I think that is a wonderful adaptation. But that's the kind of book, sort of like, say, Treasure, Sierra Madre, something like that. Little simple books that aren't really great books by any measure, but make good movies. Over here.
What about the movie that they made from your novel, Leaving Cheyenne? Did you like it? I haven't seen it.
It was a sort of a hilarious project. I thought it was hilarious, actually. It was so grotesque, you know. It was a grotesque movie made from my second novel. It's kind of funny. It shows you how things sometimes work. The young man who originally bought the Last Picture Show was a young man named Stephen J. Friedman, a New York lawyer who decided he wanted to be a movie maker. And I don't think I'm being too unkind to him to say that he had nothing going for him at all except persistence. He bought the Last Picture Show, and he kept it for 5 years, didn't manage to do a single thing with it, lost control of it to a far more accomplished producer. However, he got producer credit on it. As far as I know, he was not around, or not allowed to be around during making the movie, and he made a lot of money in it. Money out of it, fine and dandy, because he did at least gamble a few $1,000s to buy the book initially. He turned around and with a desperate recklessness, he sank all his Last Picture Show winnings into making my unmakeable second novel, Leaving Cheyenne, which had thwarted better talents than him for a period of about 11 years. Leaving Cheyenne is a Jules and Jim story. It's a story of two men and a woman, a lifetime triangular romance with a time span of 45 years. Very difficult for the movies to work with a 45-year time span. Stephen J. Friedman was undaunted, and he sailed ahead after Robert Altman and about 15 or 20 other people had failed, and he produced this grotesquerie called Loving Molly, which was in release for about a week and plummeted. You know, you hear how much money a successful movie can make, but you don't really hear about how little money an unsuccessful movie can make. That movie made about $16,000 on the cost of $2 million or something like that. So, for Stephen J. Friedman. However, he's gone on and made other movies. He hasn't been the least bit discouraged. But that's it's a really strange movie. It has more gaps in terms of editorial sloppiness in it than any movie I've ever seen. It's very funny to watch it if you watch it from that perspective.
Does that bother you in terms of having written the book?
No, it doesn't bother me at all. The book is perfectly safe. The book is mine, and the movie belongs to Sidney Lumet and Stephen J. Friedman. Sidney Lumet, it was mostly filmed in New Jersey because Sidney Lumet got scared in Texas, I think. I think he didn't like it down there at all. And I don't necessarily blame him, but he just rushed right back to New Jersey. And while he was in Texas, the 3 weeks that he spent there, he shot so fast they could hardly get camera in the film. And it's just bizarre. There are just things that you won't see in any other movie. It nearly killed my father. It's the only thing I really have against it. My father was a cattleman of, as my introducer said, of several generations with very firm ideas about what cowboys were and what they wore. And they certainly wore boots and Levi's, and they did not wear the kind of overalls, bib overalls that farmers wear, and clodhopper shoes, such as farmers wear. Well, what should the cowboys in leaving in this loving Molly be wearing but bib overalls and clodhopper shoes? My father was just mortified by that. So the family was disgraced. And there was no hope, and it darkened his last years a little bit. Yes.
Did your father drive a Cadillac, and what is your fantasy with Cadillacs?
No, my father didn't drive a Cadillac. I rent Cadillacs when I go on long road trips because they're very economical to rent and they're very comfortable cars. I'll tell you, I think that question must stem from the title of my most recently published book, Cadillac Jack, which it's another one of those little données you sometimes get. I was standing on a street corner in Washington, and a black man was standing there sort of dozing, and a big white Cadillac drove up to the curb, and the man in the Cadillac yelled at the man that was dozing, and he woke up and he said, "Ho, ho, ho, Cadillac Jack." And I thought, wow, what a good title. So I immediately took it and wrote a book around it. But I don't have any deep passion for Cadillacs one way or the other. Well, maybe we should continue this elsewhere if you've asked all the questions you want to ask.
There will be a
reception following immediately at the President Vickers' house, straight down the walkway here, the other side of the ad building.